The luxury brand refused to sell him parts. Not knowing he held the patent on all of them, 41 people stood in the marble lobby of Veltron, Automotive's North American headquarters, every one of them in a blazer, every one of them holding a leather folio, every one of them waiting for the same meeting. Then the glass door opened and Mason Cole walked in. Worn boots, denim jacket with a fraying cuff. Behind him, a 5-year-old girl in a yellow raincoat clutching a small stuffed rabbit with one floppy ear and a button eye that didn't match the other. The laughter started before he reached the reception desk. A man in a charcoal suit leaned to the woman beside him and said something with his hand near his mouth. 3 people turned. 2 of them smiled. Mason did not look at them. He did not slow down. He did not give those 41 people anything but his back. He walked to the reception desk, said his name in a voice that was neither loud nor quiet, and waited. What none of them knew, what the woman behind that desk did not know, what the VP of licensing watching from the mezzanine did not know, what the silver-haired man in the 14th floor conference room did not know, was that the parts they had spent 7 weeks refusing to sell Mason Cole belonged to Mason Cole. Not some of them, not most of them. Every last patent, every drawing, every engineered dimension that had been quietly earning Veltron money for 11 years. All of it his. Stay with this one. It earns it. The Veltron building was the kind of place that told you exactly how important it thought it was before you set foot inside it. 60 feet of glass facade. A lobby with a waterfall feature that served no function except to remind you of the cost of running water for no reason. The receptionist had a headset and a practiced expression of polite distance. The kind that comes from years of making people feel slightly less than welcome while remaining technically civil. It was a professional skill. She had it. Mason stood at the desk with his daughter, Lily, on his left side, her small hand wrapped around 2 of his fingers. The stuffed rabbit, her rabbit, the one she called Pip, dangled from her other hand. Its one good eye pointed at the floor. The second eye had come off in the washing machine 8 months ago. Lily had cried. Mason had searched the entire laundry room on his hands and knees and found the button under the machine and sewn it back on himself. And it was slightly different from the original. Darker, larger by a few millimeters. And now Pip had 2 eyes that looked at the world slightly, differently from each other, which Lily had decided was fine. Because sometimes you look at things differently on different sides. Mason told the receptionist his name. She typed it. She looked at the screen. She looked at him. She typed it again. He had an appointment. He had a confirmation number in his phone. He had a reference number he recited from memory in the same flat tone he used when he ordered coffee and had already decided what size before he walked in. The receptionist told him to take a seat. He sat. Lily climbed into the chair beside him and placed Pip on her knee, arranging the rabbit's legs carefully so it sat upright. She looked at the waterfall for a moment. She looked at Mason. She said, "Are those people going to help us fix it?" He looked at the 41 people in their blazers. Most of them were looking at their phones. A few were talking in the low collaborative voices of people who already knew they were on the same side of something. He said, "We'll see." He had been trying to fix it for 7 weeks. The engine was a Veltron Stratos V12, a limited production motor from the early manufacturing run, hand-assembled in a facility that no longer existed, built to a specification that no longer existed in any service manual you could buy or request through any legitimate channel. Not 3 of them remained in drivable condition anywhere in North America. One was in a private collection in Scottsdale. One sat in a climate-controlled garage in Toronto, belonging to a man who hadn't started it in 6 years and told people about it at dinner parties more often than he visited it. And one sat in the workshop behind Mason Cole's rented house, on a street where 3 of the 6 streetlights didn't work. and the neighbor's dog barked every morning from 7 until it got bored and almost stopped. Macyson had bought the car for $400 from an estate sale. The listing had included 2 photos taken from bad angles and a description that said, "Project vehicle, runs rough." The man who listed it knew what it was, but not what it was worth. The engine had seized. The injector's assembly was gone. Not broken, gone, removed by someone, and never returned. 2 of the cam cover seals had disintegrated into something that resembled charcoal dust pressed between your fingers. But the block was clean. The heads were true. The internal tolerances, as when he measured them, were the kind of tolerances you only found in engines that had been touched by someone who understood tolerances, the way a musician understands. Intervals, not as a measurement, but as a relationship. He had spent 3 weeks documenting everything before he touched a single component. Every bore measurement, every thread pitch, every casting mark, every clearance. He did this the way he did most things. At a workbench lit by a single overhead lamp, with Lily asleep in the room above him, with the house quiet around him, with Pip on the workbench near his elbow, because Lily always left Pip near things she wanted kept safe. The parts didn't exist in any catalog he could locate. Veltron had discontinued the line. Veltron had discontinued the whole vehicle program. Veltron had, from the perspective of its current management, no obligation whatsoever to support a 12-year-old platform that had been officially retired before half its current employees had started working there. He had called them in week 1. He had been transferred 4 times and had ended up speaking to someone who told him that discontinued parts were not manufactured and not stocked, and that he should try aftermarket suppliers, which was not a suggestion that helped, but was delivered with warmth. He had tried aftermarket suppliers, 3 of them. The dimensions were wrong by margins that were small enough that the suppliers insisted they were within tolerance and large enough that Mason knew they weren't. 1 set of cam seals had failed within 40 minutes of installation at idle temperature, not blown out, not cracked, sheared, precisely along the axis where the thermal expansion hadn't been calculated correctly. He had rebuilt that section of the engine twice in a single evening. Lily in the workshop doorway in her pajamas, with Pip tucked under her arm, watching him, asking why his hands were always dirty. He had said, "Because that's where the work is." She had thought about this for a moment and then said, "Okay," and gone back to bed. In week 3, he had driven to the storage unit. He rented it for $60 a month, had rented it for 8 years, had gone there fewer than 10 times since he started renting it. Inside were boxes from the apartment before the house before this house, the job before everything changed. Things he hadn't been able to throw away and hadn't been able to look at for reasons that weren't technical. He found the right box near the back wall. Cardboard, taped with the kind of tape that had dried out and gone brittle. Labeled in marker ink that had faded to near illegibility. Inside the box were notebooks. His old notebooks, graph paper, the kind he'd used when he was still writing calculations by hand because he thought better when the pen had weight. Inside the box were technical drawings. Inside the box were 3 patent filings, each one stamped with a United States registration number, each one bearing a name in the inventor field. His name. Not a name that sounded similar. Not a filing from a collaborative effort where his name might have appeared alongside others. His name, alone, on all 3 filings, with his signature, with the address of an apartment he had lived in 13 years ago, when he was 27, and working 18-hour days in a facility that smelled of metal and synthetic coolant, and the particular ozone smell of precision equipment running at capacity. He had sat with those documents on the floor of the storage unit for a long time. The overhead fluorescent had flickered once and steadied. He had read each filing 3 times, not because he needed to understand the content. He had written the content. He knew the content in the way you know something you spent 2 years building from the ground up. But because he needed to understand the shape of what he was looking at, then he had driven home. He had put Lily to bed. He had gone back to the workshop and looked at the engine block and the documents side by side. And what he saw was the injector geometry he had filed, the cam timing architecture he had filed, the sealing system he had filed, all present in the engine on his bench. An engine made by Veltron. An engine that had earned Veltron significant revenue for a decade in parts and service contracts and licensing arrangements, with 3 international manufacturers whose names appeared in the continuation filings that Crawford Vane had quietly appended to Mason's original patents under Veltron's name instead. He had sat with that for 3 hours. Then he had made a call. Then he had called Elijah. Elijah Marsh ran a machining shop 7 blocks from Mason's house. He was 61, bearded, spoke in a register that suggested he had considered most situations thoroughly before saying anything about them. He had worked in the same facility as Mason for 14 months, in a different capacity, years ago. He had seen Mason's drawings. He had seen the testing data, which was the kind of data that other engineers in the facility had walked past and looked at, and then looked at again. He had known what Mason was doing. He had also known because Elijah Marsh was a man who paid attention. When Mason had stopped coming to work, he had known why. And he had known, in the particular way you know things about work you've studied closely, that certain design signatures he'd subsequently seen in Veltron's commercial catalog were not Veltron's. When Mason spread the documents on Elijah's workbench, Elijah had read all 3 filings in full. He set them down on the steel surface. He looked at the bench and not at Mason for a long moment. He said, "You've been letting this sit in a box for 9 years." Mason said, "I had other things." Elijah looked at him, not at the documents, at him directly. The way older men look at younger ones when they are deciding whether to say the harder thing or the easier one. He said, "You want a witness?" Mason said, "Not yet." Elijah nodded. He picked up a torque wrench and turned back to the engine block on his bench. He said nothing else. There was nothing else to say, and they both understood that. What Elijah knew, had always known, because he had been paying a kind of attention that did not announce itself, was that the injector architecture in the Veltron Stratos V12 was not something Veltron's internal team had produced. The geometry was wrong for their profile. The sealing approach was different in a way that was hard to articulate to someone who wasn't looking closely, but obvious to someone who was. The tolerances were a signature. You could read a tolerance the way you could read handwriting, if you knew whose handwriting you were looking for. Elijah had known. The first time he'd held a disassembled injector housing from one of these engines, whose design it reflected. He had known because he'd watched those hands build it, in a facility that had since been knocked down, in a room that didn't exist anymore, except in the memory of the few people who'd worked in it. The car he had watched those hands build it for had been his wife's. Her name had been Kara. She had died in a car accident 2.5 years ago, in February, on a road that had ice on it that the forecast hadn't mentioned. She had been 29. Lily had been 2. The grief of that was not something Mason talked about. Not because he hadn't processed it. He had, slowly, in the way you process things you can't afford to stop functioning about. In the quiet hours, in the workshop, in the specific kind of silence that comes from working with your hands on something that requires your full attention, and therefore allows the rest of you to exist at a lower volume for a while. The sketchbook in the drawer in the bedroom had some of her drawings in it. Not many. A dozen, maybe. From the last year, quick ones in her lighter style, loose than his, with more space between the lines. One of them was Lily, smaller, in a coat with a hood, on a street that wasn't this street, chasing something out of frame. He hadn't looked at that drawing in over a year, but he knew it was there. He thought about it sometimes when he needed to know that something was where he left it. At 10:14 in the morning, Mason sat in the marble lobby with Lily beside him, and Pip in Lily's lap and the document tube under his arm, and the 41 people in their blazers moved around them the way water moves around something fixed. At 10:31, Vivian Holt came down from the mezzanine. She was 32, perhaps 33, in a slate-gray suit with her hair pulled back with the precision of someone who did not have time to think about her appearance, and therefore thought about it very carefully, so it required no further thought during the day. She moved through the lobby the way people do when they are used to rooms organizing themselves around them. She had been VP of licensing at Veltron for 14 months, appointed after a restructuring that had removed a significant portion of the previous executive tier. She was good at her job. She was also, as Mason would understand more fully over the course of the next 2 hours, working with a picture of reality that had been carefully curated by someone who had been in the building much longer than she had, and who had reasons to keep certain parts of that picture out of frame. She stopped when she saw Mason. Not dramatically, a small calibration. Her eyes moved from him to the document tube, to Lily, to Pip, the rabbit, the mismatched eyes, the floppy ear. And she recomposed, and she crossed the lobby with her hand extended. She said, "Mr. Cole," and her voice had the specific quality of someone extending courtesy as a professional discipline rather than a natural instinct. He stood. He said yes. She looked at Lily. She said, "You brought a child to a licensing meeting." He said, "She's mine. I didn't have anyone to leave her with today." A pause, not long, not rude, but present. She said, "Our conference room is on the 14th floor. We don't typically have accommodations for children." He said, "She's quiet." Lily, who had been watching this exchange, looked at Vivian Holt. She held Pip slightly outward and upward, which was what she did when she was uncertain about a new person. Not as an offering exactly, but as a kind of introduction. The rabbit's floppy ear hung to the left. The mismatched button eye regarded the VP of licensing without judgment of any kind. Vivian turned and walked toward the elevator. Mason picked up the document tube. Lily took his fingers again. The conference room on the 14th floor had a view of the city that meant something to people who noticed views. Mason noticed the table, which was long and oval and had 12 chairs. On the far side of the table sat a man he had not expected. 50, perhaps 52. Silver hair, cut correctly. A suit that fit the way suits fit when someone has been wearing them long enough, that they've learned how they're supposed to fit. A watch that cost more than the car Mason had purchased for $400. He was introduced as Crawford Vane, Senior Director of Intellectual Property Strategy. And he had been in this building for 11 years, and he smiled at Mason with a warmth that occupied his face without reaching any deeper than that. Crawford said, "We understand you've had some difficulty sourcing legacy components. We'll do whatever we reasonably can, but I should be upfront. Our position on discontinued platforms is well established, and for good reasons." Mason sat down. Lily climbed into the chair beside him and placed Pip on the table in front of her, orienting the rabbit to face outward toward the room. Crawford Vane glanced at the rabbit. His expression remained pleasantly neutral. Mason said, "I appreciate you taking the meeting." He meant it. He said most things he meant, which was why he said relatively few things. Vivian opened her folder. She said, "Our records show 3 inquiries from you over the past 7 weeks. 2 telephone contacts, 1 email. In each case, our parts team responded with the same information. The Stratos V12 platform was formally discontinued 11 years ago. We have no inventory. We have no active supplier relationships for that platform. That position has not changed." Mason nodded. Crawford said, "Frankly, Mr. Cole, and I want to be direct with you, because I respect your time. Even in the hypothetical where we could locate these components, the liability exposure around providing discontinued parts to a private restoration customer is substantial. We're simply not in a position to open that door. Mason said, I understand that position. Lily was watching the room, calm and specific, the way children watch things they're trying to understand. She had placed both hands in her lap. Pip sat on the table between her elbow and the edge of the surface. Crawford said, So what exactly were you hoping we could offer you today? Mason set the document tube on the table. He uncapped it. He removed 3 rolled documents, each bound with a rubber band. He set them on the table parallel to each other and unrolled the first one and held the corners down with his palms. It was a patent filing. United States Patent number 9,847,201, filed 13 years ago, awarded 11 years ago. The inventor field on line 1 read, Mason A. Cole. The registration stamp was dark and precise. The signature in the lower right corner was not faded and was not ambiguous. He said, I'm not here about buying parts. The conference room was quiet, not the quiet of a natural pause. The quiet of a room where everyone has stopped maintaining whatever face they had been maintaining. He said, I'm here to understand why Veltron has been manufacturing and licensing components under patents that were never legally transferred to this company. Crawford Vane's face did not move. That was the tell. Not shock, not confusion, not even controlled irritation, the absence of surprise. The expression of a man who had known this moment was possible and had prepared something for it. He reached for the folder in front of him, turned 2 pages with the practiced evenness of someone who has rehearsed appearing unhurried, and said, There may be some confusion here about provenance. Veltron acquired a number of IP assets in the 2013 restructuring, and the documentation chain on those assets was complex. I'd want our full legal team present before we get into specifics. Mason placed the second document on the table. Vivian Holt was no longer looking at her folder. The second document was not a patent. It was a letter on Veltron corporate letterhead, dated 9 years ago, signed by Crawford Vane. It was addressed to a law firm that had since dissolved. It described, in its second paragraph, a set of intellectual property assets as having been acquired through a prior contractor arrangement, a description that was not accurate. There had been no contractor arrangement. There had been no arrangement of any kind. Crawford Vane had authored a memo that described a transaction that had not occurred, and he had introduced that memo into Velt's records at a moment when the actual inventor was 3 weeks out of a hospital, newly alone, and not in a position to review intellectual property documentation. Crawford looked at the letter. He looked at it for a long time without his expression changing, which was itself a kind of change. He said, I'd need legal present before we continue. Mason said, Of course. He did not take the documents back. He capped the tube and left both documents on the table, and set his hands flat on the surface and waited in the particular way of someone who has been waiting for a long time and has no difficulty continuing. Lily picked up Pip and settled the rabbit in her lap and looked at the window. Vivian Holt said, Crawford, step out. He looked at her. She did not repeat it loudly. She said it the same way, flat, 2 words, the kind of instruction that leaves no grammatical room for negotiation. He stood. He gathered nothing from the table. He walked to the door and through it, and the door closed behind him with the soft pneumatic certainty of a well-made door. At 11:42 in the morning, Vivian called 2 people simultaneously. One was Veltron's general counsel. The other was Eleanor Marsh, who had sat on the Veltron board since before the 2013 restructuring, and who answered on the second ring and listened to Vivian's summary without interrupting, and then said 3 words with the efficiency of someone who has evaluated a great many situations in a great many conference rooms. Get him back. While they waited, Lily crossed to the window. She pressed her forehead gently against the glass and looked at the city spread below. In the midday light, she said, "You can see a lot from up here." Mason said yes, she said, "But you still can't see our street." He said no. She pressed Pip gently to the glass beside her face, as if offering the rabbit the same view. And she stood like that for a moment, the yellow coat, the mismatched eyes, the city in the background saying nothing about any of it. He watched her. He thought about the sketchbook in the drawer. He thought about lighter, faster strokes. He thought about a coat with a hood and a street that wasn't this street, and something out of frame that Dee never asked about and now couldn't. He turned back to the table. Eleanor Marsh arrived at 12:09. She was 67, precise, with the deliberate stillness of someone who has learned, over decades, to move carefully in rooms where important things are said. Behind her came two members of the legal team, and Vivienne's assistant Grace, who had spent the preceding 40 minutes pulling internal records at Vivienne's request, and who had, in pulling those records, discovered 3 things she found deeply troubling and had placed in a folder she set on the table without a word. Vivienne opened the folder. She read. She turned a page. She turned another. She closed it and looked at Mason and said, "The 2013 acquisition file. There is no signed transfer agreement for the injector IP. There is Crawford's memo characterizing it as a prior contractor arrangement. But there is no contractor agreement, no payment record, and no executed instrument of any kind." She paused. "The memo is the only documentation, and Crawford authored the memo." Mason said, "I know." She said, "He created a paper record implying a transaction that did not occur." He said, "Yes." She was quiet. Not the quiet of processing. The quiet of someone who has arrived at the full shape of something and is not looking away from it. She said, "How long have you known the full picture?" He said, "About the falsified documentation. 7 weeks since I found the patents. About what Crawford specifically did. 3 hours after I found them, when I cross-referenced the continuation filings." Eleanor Marsh said, "Mr. Cole, what you've presented is consistent with an unauthorized appropriation of intellectual property that occurred during a period of significant institutional distraction. If the internal documentation was fabricated to support that appropriation, we are looking at something considerably beyond a licensing dispute." She was looking at him steadily. "What do you want from this meeting?" He said, "I want the parts to finish the engine. And I want the patents formally restored under my name with the fabricated documentation corrected in the record." She said, "Is that the entirety of it?" He said, "For now." She nodded, not like she was agreeing, like she was hearing him precisely. At 12:27, 2 men who were not part of Veltron's legal team entered the building. They spoke to reception. They were directed to the adjacent room where Crawford Vane had been waiting. Crawford stood when they entered. He said something that did not carry through the glass. He adjusted his jacket once, a precise, habitual motion. He left the building with the 2 men at 12:31, and the watch on his wrist caught a strip of afternoon light as he passed the conference room window, and then the lobby swallowed all 3 of them, and they were gone. Vivienne closed her folder. She opened the one Grace had prepared. She read the first 2 pages, and then closed that one, too. She stood from her chair and walked around the end of the table. Not to the window, not to the door, to where Lily sat, and she crouched, not kneeled. Crouched, lowering herself deliberately to the height of a 5-year-old girl in a yellow raincoat, so that when she spoke, she was speaking to Lily directly and not to the top of her head. She said, "I'm sorry we weren't more helpful when your dad called." Lily looked at her. She considered this with the particular gravity of children, when they sense that an adult is being genuinely honest, rather than performing honesty. She looked at Pip. She looked back at Vivienne Holt, who was crouching at the foot of a long oval conference table on the 14th floor of a building with an unnecessary waterfall in the lobby, and she said, in a voice that was neither large nor small, "He always fixes things. He just needs the right parts." The room did not make a sound. Vivienne stood slowly. She straightened her jacket. She looked at Mason with an expression that had shed whatever professional calibration had been in it before, and she said, "We'll have archival inventory pulled and the parts ready by Friday. I'd like to schedule a formal session with our IP counsel and whoever you bring next week for the patent restoration and the royalty calculation." Mason said, "I don't have representation," she said. "We'll provide a referral from outside our firm. Their fees on this matter will be covered by Veltron," he said. "I appreciate that." Eleanor Marsh set a card on the table. "Small, heavy stock," she said. "There is one additional matter." She looked at him without hurry. "Veltran has a technical consulting arrangement for restoration work on legacy platforms. Quiet work. Flexible schedule. The compensation is appropriate to the expertise." She looked at him. "It's yours, Mr. Cole. Not as an obligation, and not as any kind of settlement term. Simply as an acknowledgement that you understand these engines better than anyone, remaining who has access to them." He picked up the card. He read it. He placed it in the front pocket of the denim jacket. He said, "I'll think about it." He said it the same way he said most things, as if the answer had been somewhere nearby for a while, and he was simply giving it a location. He gathered the documents. He capped the tube. He put on the jacket. He stood, and Lily slid from her chair, and she tucked Pip firmly under one arm so the rabbit's good eye faced forward. And she took Mason's fingers with her free hand, and they crossed the room to the door. At the threshold, Lily paused. She turned and looked at the room one final time. At Vivienne, at Eleanor, at Grace still standing near the wall. She raised Pip's left paw in a gesture that was almost a wave. Then she turned and walked out. Mason did not look back. Elijah Marsh was sitting on an overturned crate outside the workshop when Mason's truck pulled into the drive that evening. He had a thermos and a newspaper folded under his arm, and the look of a man who has been sitting somewhere long enough that sitting has become the primary thing he is doing. He looked up when Mason parked. He looked at Lily climbing down from the back seat, with Pip pressed to her chest. He looked at Mason. He said, "How'd it go?" It wasn't a question. It was the sentence of a man checking something he had already estimated. Mason said, "It went." Elijah said, "The parts." Mason said, "Friday." Elijah nodded slowly twice. He held out the thermos. Mason took it, drank, handed it back. The metal was warm against his palm. Elijah said, "Crawford Vane." Mason said, "He left with two men who weren't from the legal department." Elijah was quiet for several seconds. He looked at the thermos. He looked at the workshop door, which was closed, and at the thin line of light under it from the lamp Mason had left on this morning. He said, "Good." He unfolded the newspaper. He opened it to a page somewhere in the middle. He did not offer anything else, and Mason did not ask for anything else, because between them there was an understanding about the economy of words that made additional ones unnecessary. Lily went into the workshop. She did this every time they came home. Not to help. She was 5. There was little she could help with, though she believed otherwise. But because she liked the smell of the place. Oil and metal, and something underneath those that didn't have a name, the smell of the particular patience that accumulated in rooms where people worked on things that required long attention. She found her stool in the corner, the one with the chipped red paint that she had picked out at a garage sale 2 years ago, and which Mason had carried to the truck under her supervision, and she sat on it with Pip in her lap and looked at the engine block on the stand in the center of the room. The engine sat the way large things sit when they are close to being finished, patient and heavy and confident in their own eventual completeness, she said. "Is it going to run?" Mason had come in behind her. He took the jacket off and hung it on the hook. He took down his work shirt and pulled it on. He stood with his hands in his pockets, looking at the engine, which was the same engine it had always been, which was not Veltron's, which had been waiting for this particular pair of hands since the estate sale, on a Tuesday in March. He said yes. She said when? He said when it has what it needs. She seemed to find this sufficient. She turned Pip to face the engine too, repositioning the rabbit carefully so both eyes, the matched one and the one slightly larger and darker, the one that looked at things differently, aimed at the block on the stand. The engine did not react to this, but Lily seemed satisfied. At 7, he made pancakes. Tuesday meant pancakes. It had meant pancakes for 3 years. Since the week Lily was old enough to associate days with things, and had decided, at 2 years old, that Tuesdays should have something, and they had made pancakes together at a counter she had stood on a step stool to reach, and it had become the thing Tuesday was, and Mason kept it the way you keep things that started as something someone needed and became something you both did. He stood at the stove with the batter and the pan and the sound of the exhaust fan, and Lily sat at the table with Pip propped against the salt shaker. The rabbit's default resting position during meals, present but not in the way. Outside, the 3 streetlights that worked on their street came on one by one as the sky went gray in the direction of the hills. She said, "Dad." He said, She said, "That lady came down to talk to me." He said, "She did." She said she looked scared. He said, "I think she was a little." Lily considered the salt shaker and Pip beside it. She said, "Of what?" He said, "Of having done the wrong thing without knowing it." She turned this over. She said, "But you can't get in trouble for not knowing." He said, "No, but you can feel bad about it." She thought about this. She rearranged Pip so the rabbit faced her instead of the shaker. She said sorry. He said, "She did." A pause. The exhaust fan. A car passing on the street outside. The dog 2 doors down barked once, experimentally, and stopped, deciding it wasn't worth it. Lily said, "That's good then." He poured the batter. He watched it spread and set at the edges. He flipped it when it was ready and watched the other side come up golden and even. He plated 2, set them on the table, sat across from her. She passed Pip to the edge of the table, out of the way but present. He poured the syrup. He handed her the fork. He cut his own pancakes and ate. The kitchen was warm. The workshop was lit. The engine on the stand in the room behind the house was waiting for Friday, patient as things are when they've been waiting long enough, that patience has become their natural condition. He ate. She ate. The street outside did what streets do at evening on a Tuesday. Held the light for a moment, then let it go.